Yep, we're good to go.
Yes, shall I start now? Okay, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Richard Burchmore. I'm associated with the Medical, Veterinary and Life Sciences Graduate School at the University of Glasgow, and I was asked to come and talk to you today about undertaking postgraduate research at the University of Glasgow. My role in the university is PGR convener in the School of Infection and Immunity, and I'm also quite an active PhD supervisor. So I'll just get going. If you have any questions as we go along, please do interrupt me or put something in the chat, or you can wait until the end if you have questions to ask. I don't mind what you do. So this is what I'm going to cover today in a presentation that it looks like will take 20 minutes, 30 minutes, something like that, depending on questions, etc. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the university as a research environment, because obviously that's very important information for you if you're thinking about undertaking a postgraduate research degree. I'm going to talk a bit about the postgraduate research options that we offer within the College of Medical, Veterinary and Life Sciences. A little bit about what actually happens on a PhD, and that's something you may have questions for. And then also how to apply to a PhD. And if you have questions there, then it might be that my colleague Anil, who's on the call, can also contribute answers there. I'll cover something about PhD programs and subjects, but I should emphasize that there's a lot of flexibility there about what you would undertake in a postgraduate research project. And then just a short list of some examples of exciting PhD research projects that we offer within our college, and a little bit about scholarships and studentships, which are obviously important to fund your postgraduate research journey. So we are the College of Medical, Veterinary and Life Sciences, and there's a few statistics on the screen currently, things that we're proud of to do with our record in research. So we're ranked first in a number of subjects and highly ranked in a number of other important subjects. A lot of our degree programs and research programs are accredited by various institutions, and we're obviously quite a large college, and we're very proud of our accreditations and our rankings within the UK. So the University of Glasgow has been recognised for a long time for its world-leading research and the positive impact that it has on society. And the most recent exercise to assess that was the Research Excellence Framework, or REF, process, which was completed in 2021, and we're just beginning to get into the program for the next REF exercise. So some of the outputs from that Research Excellence Framework exercise is that Scotland is number one. Glasgow is number one in Scotland for grade point average, and it's also the first in Scotland for research outputs. In the Russell Group of universities, the University of Glasgow is 13th for research power. So first of all, you may not know what the Russell Group is. The Russell Group is a group of 24 very research intensive universities in the UK. There are two Russell Group universities in Scotland, University of Glasgow and University of Edinburgh. So we are second in Scotland and 13th overall for the Russell Group in the UK. And then you may also be wondering what research power is. So that's a combined measure of both the quality and quantity of research that we undertake. So larger universities tend to have higher research power. What we can control more is the quality of the research that we produce. And the quality of research across the board from our college is very high. And that's evidenced by us being, although we're 13th in the Russell Group for research power, we're 5th in the Russell Group for 4-star research outputs. So 4-star research outputs are the best research outputs that can be measured. So they are internationally excellent. And that's measured in a variety of ways, which I don't have time to go into now. And that's a big increase for us that we're very pleased with since the REF exercise in 2014. There are also 8 Nobel laureates that are associated with the university in one way or another. So 5 of those are in chemistry, 2 in medicine, and 1 Nobel Peace Prize. I've clicked something on my computer which is stopping me from advancing the slides. Give me a second. Ah, there we are. So a few more pieces of information about those research highlights. The College of Medical, Veterinary and Life Sciences has an annual research income of £120 million, and it's third ranked in the UK by the Times Higher Education Supplement on Impact rankings, and 12th globally, which is, when you think about it, a very high ranking. £22 million of our income is generated through funding associated with industry and translational funding. So translational funding is funding for projects which have a more immediate application. So rather than basic research, just trying to understand something about biology or some process that can be studied with science, translational funding focuses more on application for society or for patients or for the environment, etc. So 12% of our research awards come from industrial funding, and about 20% of our academic staff have funding or partnerships with industry. And we're emphasizing industry here because association with industry is very important because it makes our work more translational. Industry is interested primarily to fund translational research, and it means that we have contacts with industrial groups like pharmaceutical companies, for example, and the all sorts of industries, but in our college particularly with pharmaceutical companies. And that means that we have those contacts which enable people who come to study for PhDs or master's programs in our college. It helps them to build a network with potential employers later on in their careers. So almost 2 million is the total value of industry awards into the College of Medical, Veterinary and Life Sciences since 2023. And we have 120 external organizations which are working with our partnerships team, and 130 researchers in the college who are engaged in those partnership projects or activities. And a few of our strategic partnerships are identified here at the bottom of the slide. So that's a little bit about the background to research in the College of Medical, Veterinary and Life Sciences. And if you're going to come to study for a postgraduate research project, then it's obviously important to come to somewhere that has a good record and a broad range of activities, both in basic science and in translational work. And I would confidently say that we do. So if you are going to come and study for a postgraduate research program, the most obvious program would be a PhD. And a PhD program is 3 to 4 years full-time. If you undertake it part-time, it can be 5 years. But most people undertake a PhD over a full-time program, and the standard approach would be that you arrive at the university, you begin your research fairly quickly after a bit of planning and reading, and you collect all of the data for your PhD in 3 years, and then you have a 4th year which you remain registered at the university, which you can use to write up. And ideally you wouldn't use all of that 4th year to write up. It really depends on your funding situation though. But you do have 4 years to complete your PhD and submit your thesis. We also offer an integrated PhD, which is 5 years full-time. The integrated PhD is a combined master's and PhD. And I'll come back to talk a little bit about the structure of that later on. And then there's the possibility of an MD, so that's a Doctor of Medicine. Typically that would be 2 years full-time or 4 years part-time, and the typical student who undertakes that would be a medical student at some point in their medical training who wants to undergo some research. And then the final opportunity on this list is an MSc by research. And this is something that's worth thinking about. Doesn't take as much time as a PhD, and it therefore doesn't require so much funding as a PhD, but it does give you a year full-time in the lab or 2 years part-time to work on data collection. It doesn't give you a PhD at the end, but it does give you significant research experience in the same kind of environment and in a team together with PhD students and everyone else who PhD students will work with. So that's an opportunity not to be overlooked, I think. What's the difference between taught and research degrees? So postgraduate research is not a taught degree, with the exception of the IPhD, which is a combined master's and PhD program. Postgraduate research programs are not taught degrees. That doesn't mean there isn't some teaching there, because there are courses that we expect our postgraduate research students to undertake, the courses that help them with their transferable skills, courses that make sure they're up to speed with the research technologies that they use, with the safety expectations, with the ethical expectations that go along with a career in research. But we don't have substantial courses which you are required to take time out of your PhD to work towards. So that means that there is much less of a timetable associated with a PhD. It's an independent piece of work. And it follows from that you must be self-motivated to undertake a PhD. There'll be lots of checks and balances and people giving you advice and chasing you if you fail to meet deadlines, etc., etc. But you have to develop everything within the PhD. The buck stops with you. You have to make sure that you are on the ball and you're motivated to do all the things that you're required to do in the timescale that's presented to you. If things go wrong, there is a good system in place to support you to allow for extensions or suspensions of studies and so on. But again, if there are problems, you need to take the initiative to solve those problems by engaging with lots of support networks that are available. Full-time research does require a very high level of commitment. I'd say part-time research also requires a high level of commitment, usually because people are undertaking part-time research because they have something else to do in the remainder of their time. And so it perhaps even requires a high level of commitment to undertake part-time research. But research generally requires commitment to the project. There will be many times in any research project, be it a PhD or much later in a research career, where things seem to be not working out, where things are going wrong, where it seems like you've not achieved very much over a substantial period of time, and you have to have the resilience to cope with that and the ability to see past those problems and to keep your eye on the goal and the big picture. The most important person to support you through all of this is your PhD supervisor, or actually generally supervisors. So you'll have a quite close relationship with a PhD supervisor. In the College of Medical, Veterinary and Life Sciences, we require all students to have 2 PhD supervisors. But there's nearly always a primary PhD supervisor who takes most responsibility for the project, and the second PhD supervisor is involved, formally involved, but may spend less time with the student. That can vary, though. In some cases, there are 2 supervisors who are equally involved in the supervision. But you would be expected to meet with one or both of your supervisors on a very regular basis. So myself, I try and meet with all of my PhD students at least once a week. And I also have a meeting for the whole team once a week. So that means I have 2 points of contact every week with every postgraduate student that I supervise. That's my own practice. That's not a rule, but I think it would be fairly typical. And you would expect to have contact face-to-face or via email with your PhD supervisor, probably on a weekly basis, allowing for holidays and so on. But it's your project. Once you get going in the lab, you're not working as a technician. You should not be waiting for instructions from your supervisor or somebody else in the team. You should be developing your project yourself. You should be designing experiments, interpreting data, telling people what you've done, getting feedback and advice from supervisors and colleagues, peers. But it's your project, and the success of it is really down to your own initiative and planning and effort. So because of that, some regular self-reflection is important, as is a progress review. So we take the progress review process very seriously. We have an annual checkpoint for PhD students where we assess what has been done in the last year and what's planned in the remaining years of the PhD. And the reason for that is to make sure that you are on track, to support you, to help you to avoid pitfalls. Many supervisors have a lot of experience and know all the kinds of things that can go wrong in a PhD. And the annual checkpoint is a place where PhD supervisors and also academic assessors, so those are people with experience of supervising PhDs, but they're not your own PhD supervisor, will review what you've done and give their opinion on what's good, what needs some extra work, and what still needs to be achieved during the PhD. Ultimately, at the end of the PhD, you're going to have a PhD viva, which is an oral exam where your PhD thesis is discussed by two or more academics. It's a substantial exam. It often takes a morning or an afternoon to complete. And you don't want to get to that point not having been through some kind of progress review already. The progress review is a kind of a mini PhD viva and a checkpoint to make sure that you're on track. I'm not saying any of this to worry you. I'm saying it to tell you that we take this very seriously and we give you lots of opportunities to engage with people who will be able to criticize your work and comment on what's good and what's missing, so that when you get to the end of your PhD, you're very well prepared, you have an excellent thesis, and you know how to discuss it confidently in your viva. And the award that you get at the end of a postgraduate research project is entirely based on the quality of the thesis. So you have to produce a quality thesis, and the quality is assessed by your PhD examiners, one of whom will be from within the University of Glasgow, an internal examiner, and one of whom will be from outside the University of Glasgow, the external examiner. Oftentimes, you need to make some corrections to your PhD thesis, as suggested by the examiners, and a typical outcome would be that you would have a period of time between 1 month and 3 months to make those corrections, and then if you complete the corrections, the PhD is awarded. So what does a research degree involve, a PhD or a master's by research? At the heart of it, in the middle of this slide, is the data that you collect and analyze. So that the data, I won't go into all the different forms of data that we might be talking about in a big college of medical, veterinary, and life sciences. It doesn't necessarily involve doing experiments in a laboratory, but often it does. You generate data, you have to process that data. Sometimes that data can be very substantial, it can be quite complicated, it can be potentially noisy, there can be lots of repeats. So you need to keep track of it all, collate it, put it together, and analyze it. And a big part of the PhD is data analysis. Probably data analysis is a bigger part than data collection, but really that depends on the actual PhD project. And so then there's a lot of other things associated with your research degree. We've still got experiments, data collection, data processing, analysis in the middle here. And the reason this is not drawn as a list, but rather as a word cloud or a phrase cloud, is because all of these things happen throughout your PhD. Obviously, at the beginning, you're going to meet your supervisor. And at the beginning, you might be spending a lot more of your time reading the literature, but you're going to engage with your supervisor throughout your PhD. You should not stop reading the literature because there'll be new papers coming out on a regular basis. You need to keep abreast of the current literature. You also need to keep going back to the literature and looking at the existing literature again and again, because it might be that the search terms you used at the beginning of your PhD weren't quite appropriate because you've changed your focus very slightly. So you need to make sure that you're always up to date with the current literature and you have a good overview of the existing literature that's relevant to your project. There's obviously, it goes without saying, a lot of thinking associated with a PhD. And there are also aspects where you need to learn how to use pieces of equipment, statistical tools. You need to learn how to be safe in the lab. You need to learn how to plan experiments and design them and organize the output from the experiments. There's a management aspect because you'll need to make sure that you have all the reagents, the equipment that you require. You may need to purchase some things. You may need to persuade your supervisor that it's necessary to purchase some things. And you'll ultimately you'll need to show some leadership. You need to take charge of your PhD project. Like a good word is ownership. You need to take ownership of your PhD project. But it might be that during your PhD, you're asked to supervise some undergraduate students who are working on small projects of their own that are related to your own interests. And so you'll have a role in leading their projects and mentoring their projects. There's no point in doing scientific research at all if you don't talk about it and explain it to people. You have to communicate. You have to give talks. And we'll give you lots of opportunity to practice giving talks internally and externally. So at lab meetings internally and going to conferences. But we'll also encourage you to get involved in aspects of science like public engagement, which often is explaining your scientific research to people who are non-scientists. That's a very important skill to have. You're going to need to produce a PhD thesis at the end, so giving you lots of practice in writing is important. You'll have finished undergraduate degrees previously. Some of you will have done masters previously, so you'll have lots of experience of writing, but we need to develop that, and we need to develop it particularly towards producing a PhD thesis that reflects your independent research, which is something you may have much less experience with. You'll have the opportunity in your PhD to undertake some demonstrating, which is essentially teaching. So working with undergraduate students, often in a teaching lab to help them to do some fairly structured experiments and explaining how they should go about doing the experiments and how they should analyze the data. So that is a good thing to have on your CV. It's also paid, so it's a useful way to supplement your income. And then in addition to those demonstrating and teaching skills, we'll give you lots of what we call transferable skills training in things like presenting data, leading groups, and communicating your results. So there's a lot involved in a research degree, and all of this happens throughout the PhD journey. So a PhD training program is a framework that allows you to structure your PhD and to gain the skills recognition that you require in order to complete a PhD. So it's not, when I talk about a PhD training program, I'm not talking about the specific research questions that are associated with your PhD. I'm talking about the transferable extracurricular skills that we want to convey or confer on all of our students during the course of their PhD. It's an opportunity to develop the skills and training gained during your research period so that that can enhance your future career and employment. So essentially, it's things that you'll put on your CV that will support you in your future endeavors, whether that is going to work in industry or looking to be a postdoc in academia or a host of other possibilities that will be open to you at the end of a PhD. So we offer access to a suite of transferable skills within our college, but we also recognize that you have other opportunities external to the college to undertake training and experiences which will develop your transferable skills. And so we include those. You can identify them and take advantage of those training opportunities during the course of your PhD. So here's the PhD training program structure laid out over a 3-year PhD. And don't worry too much about what the individual boxes identify here, because you'll see that effective communication and researcher integrity are listed on all of them. So that really is just to get across the message that this is a process that continues throughout your PhD. At the beginning, there are some areas that we want you to start thinking about, and then as you go through towards the latter part of your PhD and you have a bit more experience in the lab and with analyzing data, then we offer some more opportunities which will help you to take advantage of the data that you've generated and the approach to the end of your PhD and your PhD thesis. So how do you apply for a PhD? In my own view, identifying potential supervisors is the key first step. So in our college, we have hundreds of research supervisors, of principal investigators who lead research teams and have the possibility to be your PhD supervisor. So the best way to go about identifying your most suitable PhD would be to identify a PhD supervisor who is undertaking research that is of interest to you. So I've just noticed that there's a couple of questions that popped up in the chat. I'll talk about those before I move forward. So somebody is asking more about the relationship with supervisors. Would you like to expand on that question a little bit? What specific question do you have about the relationship with supervisors?
Oh, okay, thank you. So I when we were talking about that point, my internet was like cutting. So I was not able to grasp what you mentioned regarding the relationship.
Okay, I'll explain it again. And I think the session is being recorded, so that if you look at the recording later, you should be able to see what I said previously without worrying about an internet connection issue. But the relationship with supervisors is at the heart of a PhD. So your PhD supervisor instructs you. It's a bit like an apprenticeship. You come to the university, you begin a project with a PhD supervisor, and then you will meet with that supervisor typically once a week, maybe more often than once a week. It varies a little bit depending on the project and the supervisor's approach. But you start out being given typically very specific instructions from the PhD supervisor about what training to do, who to work with in the lab, what experiments to start doing. And then as you progress during your first year, the discussion with the PhD supervisor should transform into something that's led more by you, where you come to the supervisor and you say, "This is what I did this week. This looks really interesting. I wonder what you think about this result that I got. I also did this experiment and I don't understand the results. Perhaps you can help me to interpret them or think about planning the experiment in a different way such that the results might be easier to understand." You might also be going to your PhD supervisor to say, "I think I need a bit of time off." You might be going to your PhD supervisor to say, "This piece of equipment in the lab is broken. Can we purchase a new piece of equipment?" So the interaction with your PhD supervisor is absolutely key to the whole of your project. Your PhD supervisor helps you to identify the research questions you're going to work on, helps you to approach those research questions, and as you get towards the end of your PhD, helps you to interpret the data, will help you to write your thesis. They won't write the thesis for you, but you will show them drafts of your thesis and they will give you comments to help you improve your writing. So it's a beginning to end relationship with a PhD supervisor. Somebody else is saying, "I did apply for a PhD position at the university. I emailed the supervisor multiple times, but I didn't get a response. Does that affect the progression of the application, or does it mean that the position is full?" It won't affect the progression of the application, but it might mean that the position is full or that the supervisor is not able to reply because they're on sabbatical. There's all sorts of reasons why you might not get a reply from a specific potential PhD supervisor. The best thing to do in that case is to identify other supervisors who work in a related area and to contact them. But although I said that identifying a potential PhD supervisor is the most important first start in a PhD application or a PGR application, that doesn't mean that you have to identify a PhD supervisor before you make the application. And we do get a lot of applications where a PhD supervisor has not been identified, and that does not prevent the application from progressing. It's just that if a potential student has already had the discussion with a PhD supervisor, then we know where to send the application, and it's likely the application will be processed very quickly because the supervisor is expecting it. So if you can identify and communicate with a PhD supervisor and name that person on your application, then it's likely the application will progress much more quickly, but it's not required. So whether or not you're able to identify and establish an interaction with a potential supervisor, you're going to need to gather various documents together to accompany your application. So you need your previous degree transcripts and certificates. You need to have 2 references. you need to have some form of a research proposal, and that's another reason for identifying a potential supervisor before making the application, because then that will really help you to develop a research proposal which is very specific for your project. But it's not very helpful to apply to the university to say that you want to study biology or pharmacology or something very general, because then we don't know, obviously, who to send that application to. If you can narrow it down by producing a research proposal, by identifying a particular research topic, or best of all, identifying a research supervisor, then it streamlines the whole process and we can move forward much more quickly. And you need to submit your CV. So how do you choose your research topic? You need to identify what your main themes of interest are, and you should all have areas where you are interested to undertake research. You will have identified those as areas that you found particularly interesting during your earlier studies. It may also be that if you are a student with a sponsor, often an international student will have a sponsor who is prepared to support you to do a program of research in a particular area. Might be pharmacology, for example. That means that you need to find a research topic that is associated with the area that is supported by your funder. It also needs to be something where there are opportunities to advance knowledge. So you need to identify research gaps in knowledge, essentially. So points where there is inconclusive research in the area, where you think you can design a series of experiments that will advance understanding of that particular research topic. And that means you need to have some future goals. You need to know what it is that you want to advance and why it's important to advance understanding of that particular area. So although you can make an application for a PhD without having a well-defined research topic, your application will be much more impressive if you have developed a research topic which is relevant to research going on in our college. So I said I'd come back to talk a little bit more about the integrated PhD process, or the IPhD. So I have a question in the chat from a master's research applicant with a potential supervisor, and we agreed with the proposal, but 12 days after the interview, I didn't get an unconditional offer. So I can't really comment on why that was. It might be to do with the funding situation. It might be because in the interview, the supervisor considered that you weren't suitable for the particular post. So I'm afraid I can't give any feedback on something like that. So going back to the integrated PhD, there are two ways that you could progress through an integrated PhD. One is that you select a PhD project. So within our schools, we have a number of PhD projects which are advertised. And then you have to identify a taught master's program which aligns with that project. So for example, you might, in my own area, you might identify a research topic in infection biology. That's where I work. And if that was the case, then you would very likely choose to undertake the MSc in infection biology, which is offered, and then you would apply to that. And if you secure funding, then you go ahead with, first of all, the master's, and then you move on to do the PhD in the same area. The other option is that you identify a suitable supervisor and you develop a research proposal together with that supervisor, and then the supervisor identifies the best master's project that's available for you, and then if funding can be secured, the project starts. So there's a fixed application period for this, because these projects will start usually at the beginning of the postgraduate research year, which is late September. So because it's a master's followed by a PhD, the project needs to start when the master's programs commence in late September. So this is a list of the PhD programs and subjects which are offered within our college. I would emphasize that this is not an exhaustive, it's an exhaustive list of the projects of the programs and subjects that are on offer. But within this long list, it's very likely that you can identify, by consulting with suitable supervisors, you can identify a specific research project that suits your interests, your funder's interest, and the interests of your supervisors. So really, this is a list which covers a tremendous amount of research that goes on in the College of Medical, Veterinary and Life Sciences. Emily's asking, can I apply for the IPhD and associated taught masters in case I don't get into the IPhD? Well, can you apply for the IPhD in case you don't get into the... Oh, I see. So you're thinking if you don't get into the IPhD, you could still apply to the taught masters? Yes, absolutely. There's no reason not to do that. The masters that would be available to you as an IPhD student are also masters that are available to PGT students, postgraduate taught students at the university. So getting to the end of my presentation now, there's a non-exhaustive list here of possibilities for funding for your postgraduate research journey. So scholarships and studentships, which are relevant to PGR students within the College of Medical, Veterinary and Life Sciences. So I won't read out the list, but there are a lot of agencies on this list that will fund PhD programs. And then for there are some agencies that fund international students, but there are a lot of government agencies who will support students traveling to the UK in order to undertake postgraduate research. So if you come from a specific country outside the UK, you may want to look for funding opportunities within your own country that will support a study period in the UK. There's a list of just a few of the some of the apparently exciting PhD projects that are available at the University of Glasgow. I say apparently because I didn't make this list, but I think all PhD projects are exciting to someone. But these are the type of project titles that you will find advertised and that you can choose from. So a lot of these are quite specific, and it may well be that if you contact the supervisor who offers this project, and let's take the first one, for example, investigating the colonic microbiome, immune interactions to prevent colorectal cancer, and you say, well, that's really fascinating, but I'm a little bit more interested in stomach cancer, or I'm not particularly interested in the colonic microbiome. I'm interested in some other aspect of microbiome research. That it might well be that you can identify a modified research project in discussion with the supervisor. But in order to do that, you have to open a discussion, first of all, with the supervisor. There's a few more things that popped up in the chat. So I'll try and deal with these in order. Will a master's research student face a knowledge gap because lack of taught material? So you're suggesting that if you come directly to do a PhD, you'll face a knowledge gap because you don't have a master's? Is that the question? Goal? I'm not sure if I fully understand the question, but we certainly have plenty of PhD students who start here without having undertaken a master's. We also have PhD students who started at Glasgow having done a master's elsewhere. So the IPhD program is really just an option that's available for people who want to study for a master's and then go directly on to a PhD. And there can be lots of advantages to doing that, practical advantages, but it's by no means essential. And at the beginning of your PhD, the first thing that you will do is fill in any of those knowledge gaps that you may have. And your supervisor will support you in doing that. So I don't think that is a major concern. We wouldn't accept you for a PhD if you didn't provide evidence that you were capable of understanding the knowledge at the level that's required to initiate a PhD. So Anil has put in some information about how to apply for a postgraduate research degree. Thanks very much for that, Anil. Ellie has asked, what is the program structure and application process of a MSc for research. It's the same as a PhD, am I correct, Anil? It's just for a shorter program.
Yeah, for a shorter program, the time frame would be similar, very similar to the PhD as well.
So again, I can't emphasize enough how important it is, first of all, to try and identify a suitable supervisor and make contact with that supervisor, because then that means you put the supervisor's name on your application. The application goes to the supervisor who says, "Oh yes, I remember Ellie got in touch and we talked about this," and it all moves much more quickly.
Hello.
Hello.
Like I was saying, because I did the application, and now I have received an email saying they have contacted one of my references. So will they have to contact both references, or is that a sign of is it a positive sign when it comes to a PhD, or
It's definitely a positive sign if they've contacted your references, your referee. I would expect them to contact both referees. And if your referees have been contacted, that means that your application is in progress. And as long as you've picked referees who are going to be supportive, then that's a very positive sign.
Yeah. Okay. Because I'm a master's student, because I'm finishing up and I've just received my final transcript. So because I'll be sending it into the adding it into the application.
Good.
So yeah. I'm just thinking at the moment it's gonna go. Yeah.
Your master's, having completed your master's, presumably one of your referees was someone involved with your master's, one of your project supervisors, or?
Yeah, the one that have replied, it's my master's supervisor.
Good. So they should be very well placed to comment on your abilities and your ability to want to take a PhD.
Yeah.
Good.
Thank you.
Okay, so I think that's pretty much the end of, that is the end of my presentation, and you've been great. You've asked lots of questions as we went along. I'm very happy to try and answer any other questions that occurred to you just now, and Anil, I'm sure will contribute too, if there is anything else.
I'll put a few links in the chat, basically for any queries you have, postgraduate research, and also for contacting supervisors, scholarships, research opportunities, and all that. So there are a few links in the chat to have a look through them.
Thank you, Anil. So before we finish, I'd just like to say good luck to you all in your journeys to find a postgraduate research opportunity.
Sorry, I had one question.
Yes.
Okay, I just wanted to ask. Of course, I was accepted for a PhD, but I'm still waiting for feedback for funding. I applied for the Commonwealth, of which I have not yet gotten the feedback. But I wanted to know if in case it doesn't come through, if there could be some possibility to apply for internal funding. And secondly, if you mentioned about TA, is it assistantships, teaching assistants? So in case someone has got a full funding and they want to teach, is that possible? And could they have, for example, if they are on a stipend, additional salary from the teaching? I just wanted to get that clarified.
Yeah, so if you undertake some demonstrating, it's usually called demonstrating when you're a PhD student, then it's first of all, it's quite limited. It's typically a few hours a week at very most. Your supervisor won't be very happy if you take a lot of time out of the lab to undertake demonstrating. So it's not really a way to fund a PhD, but it is a way to supplement a little bit of the funds that you have available to support yourself during a PhD. I would think of it more importantly as a way to gain experience of teaching and mentoring students, so that something that's useful for your CV in the long term. In terms of internal funding, there are some internal funds available for PhD programs, and Neil may be able to provide you a little bit more information about that. So is the McClure Smith Scholarship still running, Anil, for example?
I'm not sure if it's available this year.
Okay. If there is anything in terms of internal funding for PhDs, could you share it with who was asking the question? Xembre?
Yep, I'll do that. I have your details, and I'll reach out to you.
Thanks, Anil. I've had some experience with Commonwealth funded students myself. It's a very good scheme, but it is quite competitive. So definitely think about alternatives as well.
Hello. I hope you have a little bit of time.
Yep.
What if the PhD is UK only student funding? How like will the student go if they get into the PhD to get that funded for funding? Because the one that I've applied for, it's for UK student only.
If it's for UK student only, that means that it's funded on the basis from usually UK government funding for training of UK students. So that means it's not available to non-UK students. The definition of UK students, I don't know exactly what that definition is, but it will only be available to people who meet that definition. But the PhD project might be available to other students too. What that advertisement means is that the PhD project is available, funded to a UK student, but to a non-UK student with funding in place, the same PhD project might well be available. The research topic might well be available.
Okay, yeah, because of like I'm a UK student, like I've met that.
Well, that's fine then. Yeah.
So I'm asking, have you got any experience dealing with someone who like is a UK student, and their like research is like fully funded, and what was the experience?
Oh, so that's probably the typical way that I mean, most UK students are funded by UK government agencies, by UKRI or various charities. Yes, I have lots of experience of supervising students in that situation. They are they're well funded. The stipend is good. There's lots of support. So yeah, I think it's an excellent option, and it's great to hear that you're eligible for it.
Yeah. Thank you.
Excuse me. I got a question here, please.
Go ahead.
I have a BSc certificate with an honors degree.
Yep.
And I want to apply. I have an application for the University of Glasgow, and I got recommendations from two referees who were an old alumnus from the University of Glasgow back in the 60s, and now they're professors that I'm working with right now.
Yep.
The question is like, is it possible for me? Can I apply immediately to a PhD and without going through the master's thought or research programs?
Yes.
Like, can I apply to an IPhD or a PhD immediately? Is it possible?
Well, an IPhD is a master's.
Yes.
You don't have to have a master's to do a PhD. It can often help because you obviously have that extra tier of training. But I did a PhD without a master's. It used to be more common, but it's still certainly possible.
Well, is it like, yeah, but the issue is I'm still looking for a funding organization. I got everything completed. I got all the document. I even have a research proposal.
Good.
It's still the funding organization that I'm missing.
Okay. Again, I don't think that funding organizations they won't exclude individuals who have a bachelor's and no master's degree. I don't see why they would exclude that, but it can be an advantage if you do have the master's degree, because you're obviously a bit further along in your journey and you've demonstrated a bit more aptitude for, well, you've done some postgraduate research. I don't know that I can't really help with identifying funding agencies, but my advice is really just to cast the net as widely as you can and apply to as many potential funders as possible. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, thank you very much indeed.
Pleasure.
Thank you.
Anyone else? There's a question from Ellie in the chat. Is there any coursework involved in MSc by research, or is it based on project work only? So it's the same as a PhD. We would expect you to undertake some transferable skills training and some technical and ethical skills training, just as we would for a PhD student. But there's no taught aspect that is different from a PGT taught master's. It's like a mini. It's a smaller project than a PhD, but you'd be working in exactly the same conditions as a PhD student, but it's shorter and you end up with a master's. I think it's a good option, which is not exploited as much as I think it should be. And that's everything in terms of what are the typical expectations for a PhD student in terms of publication and conference presentations? So typically, we would expect a PhD student to attend one national or international conference as a minimum during the PhD, often in the final year. In terms of publication, you are not required to publish any of the work from your PhD. You can complete your thesis and achieve your viva, get your PhD without having any publications. But one of the criteria which the examiners are asked to look at is whether the work is publishable. It needs to be publishable, but it doesn't have to be published. I would highly encourage you to try and publish your research during the course of your PhD, because you want to have publications for your CV, and because it puts you in a much stronger position when you come to a PhD viva if you've already published some of the work that's in your thesis. That's a good question. Okay, that's everything. That I think I've answered all the questions that were in the chat, and nobody else is shouting out, so we can probably close this session. Thanks very much for coming along, and again, good luck to you all.